Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs again. Sorry everyone, we seem to have lost the stream there to a little internet glitch. So we're starting over.
So just to keep people on where we are today, we're talking about morale in classic D&D, and we're asking the question: what's the best mechanic for knowing if your NPCs fight or run away, or do you even need one at all? And this is such a great conversation that Paul and I were really into it for fully 6 minutes before we realized that the stream was off. So we apologize, but Paul and I are having a really great conversation that you couldn't see over here.
All right. I don't want to waste too much time gnashing our teeth over the fact that we lost a little bit here. So we've been talking about morale, and we've been talking about the history of it, and frankly, we had started to get into our personal tastes on it. But I feel like I want to put a pin on that, Dan, and I want to go back and talk. And let's just look at what we were looking at before, which is these are the three morale systems in Chainmail, right? Because the OD&D tells us look at Chainmail. Here's the three different systems. Now check me on this, Dan, because I want to know, because I haven't dug into this. I haven't really read Chainmail super closely. Are these three conflicting systems? Are these just three different use cases? What's the big difference between these three chunks of text here?
So the top two, what I'm calling version A, version B, are both meant to be used, right? And version A is this post-melee morale system where you have a one round of melee, and then you count up the casualties, and you multiply by a multiplier for how aggressive the unit is, come up with a number between 0 and 100, and you get a variety of different cases at the end of a melee. And then this the second one here, system B, the instability due to excess casualties, is something that gets triggered at a specific casualty threshold. So as I pointed out before, the second column there, if you're peasants, once you lose 25% of the unit, you need to make a check. And in the middle, it would be at 33%. And if you're mounted knights, you're very aggressive, you make that check at 50%. So the post-melee morale should be happening every round, to my understanding. And then this instability due to excess casualties kicks in after a certain number of casualties have finally accrued to the unit. The last one there, version C, seems to be a modification specifically in the man-to-man morale. So that case C would be the man-to-man case, which even that's a little bit unclear how that links up to the other ones, because it says use the prior one, but which one? So probably it's a modification of item B for the zoom in scale.
I mean, that's fascinating to me that what you're looking at here are three different use cases, really, right? Sort of the every round versus the mass casualty versus man to man. But that then the first two, the rules are different, right? They're not
very.
Right, the actual mechanics of how to roll morale, right? So the two questions we come up with morale are when to use it and how to use it, and the fact that we're given two different hows here, and then a third one that says use the previous, that's super confusing,
right?
Super confusing,
right?
And maybe in a war game it's less important because maybe in the war game you can just say, okay, I mean. Certainly, it's important for the third one, which is being confusing about which system to use. But you can just sort of, I almost think you can kind of compartmentalize and say, okay, during this phase of the war game we do this rule, and during that phase of the war game we do that rule. And you could probably do all three, right? I don't know. I've never played Chainmail explicitly just to play Chainmail. I've only ever seen it as a source for D&D rules.
Yep. Yeah. Agreed. And how you specifically, even where original D&D says, well, for morale, you could use our reaction table here, and you have to make a bunch of interpretations like the ones you're asking about, or you could use Chainmail, right? Which of those three systems? And to my knowledge, I mean, no one's ever said that clearly the original game runners did this. And I've seen, one of the original players, Mike Mornard, suggest that for D&D you could use system B in Chainmail, the excess casualty table, but in so doing you have to make up a connection between your monsters and those troop types, because this wasn't part of the fantasy stuff. So you have, in that system B, the table has peasants and heavy foot and medium horse and mounted knights, and you'd have to make a decision about what do goblins count as, what do orcs count as, because in Chainmail you actually do have specific points for System A, but here's one of the early players saying you really ought to use System B, and System C for man-to-man seems to be linked up with System B, so you could possibly go in any one of those directions legitimately.
Okay. Let's move forward in the timeline, Dan. This surely gets cleaned up perfectly in the next iteration, right?
Oh, good reaction check. so in the yellow, so the yellow coded page. So here's again part where I've snipped out about 2 pages of modifiers. Like in all these images, I snipped out about a whole page of huge modifiers. So this is Swords and Spells, which counts as original D&D. It's one of the it's the last little brown book supplement for original D&D, and it's complicated. You're not even seeing all the modifiers there, but the basis of it is you can see that table in the middle is the hit dice, right, turn into a base morale score. So if you are 1 hit die, you have a 40% chance to succeed at morale, right? This is a percentile system. If you are 6 hit dice, you have a 55% chance of making morale, and more or less it goes up about 5%. More or less per hit die, basically. So the more hit dice you have, presumably the more aggressive you are. And then your question about when do you make a morale roll? Well, Paul, your answer is clearly answered. Your question is clearly answered by that 14 bullet point list. So 1 through 14 are 14 different cases for when you roll morale. Apply the page of modifiers that I left off screen. And then if you fail, you start moving down this ladder of morale states. Right at the bottom, there's 5 different states, and you go regular, shaken, disordered, routed as you make lots and lots of morale checks and start moving in this table here.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Yeah, right.
I think I'm failing my morale check on this group of rules.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
And like the very first trigger is you have to make a morale check. Like bullet point number 1 is you have to make a morale check every 10% of casualties. So one of the major, when I've played Swords and Spells, the major paper shuffling is I have to have a roster of the total hit points of every unit, and I have to have a 10 bullet point. When you reach this hit point level, that triggers another morale check, and it takes a lot of paper, frankly, a lot of math and a lot of paper.
Yeah, that looks rough. And this is I feel like another pain point of taking wargame rules and applying them to small numbered skirmishes, right? Because like, what is 10% of casualties when you're fighting an ogre or 3 goblins, right? Like, oh God, please don't make me do that math. Right.
Well, interestingly, right, if I jump ahead a little bit, that is, our friend Keith Amon, who writes for 5th edition D&D.
A little bit. That's all jumping ahead a lot. Okay.
So that's what he does, right? So Keith, with the Monsters Know What They're Doing system, he specifies a particular hit point percentage threshold at which point the monster will just run away. And sometimes it's 10% or 30% or 60%, depending on the behavior or the intelligence or the wisdom. And, so he'll say, for this monster, if it's got 45 hit points, then it will definitely run away when you get to 31 or something like that. And I agree with you. That seems, I haven't tried to run things that way, but it seems I'm kind of a mathy guy, and that seems kind of heavyweight to me.
That seems very fiddly. That's too much. Frankly, when we get into our own personal preferences, I will voice how much most of this stuff is too much for me. But let's move on. What are we looking at here, Dan?
Okay, so here is 1st edition, or what we'd call AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, when it was first published. And thanks to Steve in the chat was asking about this. So 1st edition AD&D, and again, I snipped out the table of when you're going to make a roll, because there's about 7. I think there's 7 triggers for the morale check and some modifiers. It's not as big as Swords and Spells, but the basis here in the middle that you can see is it's percentage-based system, and the basis is 50% chance to make morale plus 5% per hit die. So very similar to Swords and Spells, Right, a lot of people look to Swords and Spells as like errata for original D&D, and clearly here's Gary Gygax using the same overall model for morale. And then once again, you have this, kind of like Chainmail, frankly, kind of like System A and Chainmail. You have this table of if you roll over your morale percent to succeed, the higher you roll over it, the more dramatic your failure is going to be. So maybe you just fall back fighting, or maybe you withdraw, or flee, or totally surrender there. And again, right, based on hit dice. So just one overall mechanic of just like the more hit dice you have, the more aggressive you're going to be. And that's more, to me at least that's something, that's part of it that I can do in my head, right? I don't need another statistic to record. I can just do, okay, what every hit die is one extra pip on a D20 basically. So I think that's better than the Swords and Spell system.
It's still very mathy for sure.
A little bit, yeah. I hear that.
And then also, a question that often comes up for me in sort of the when question: when do you check morale? Like if we're saying, that the morale check is based on, damage essentially, right? Because it's per hit point, et cetera, et cetera. Do you roll the morale check as soon as they take the damage? Do you wait for their turn? Do you roll the morale check as they take the damage, and then you need to note to self in future when the monster gets an action, they're going to do this?
Well, that's an interesting question. So for first edition AD&D here, and I will point out, right, this is not marked as optional. I don't think many people use this system. I think frequently people are surprised. They don't even, they're a first edition player. They may not even know that this is in the DM's guide, but it's not marked as optional or anything like that. I think if I grab my my DM's guide here, I think the triggers, right, it's unit based. Kind of like the excess casualty idea. So the triggers are probably like when the unit loses 25%, I think. It's like the first one.
Yeah. But again, my question here is, right, that's going to happen on the player's turn, right? Player does damage, that is triggered a morale check. Do you roll it immediately? Right? Do you wait for the monster's turn to come up?
Good point.
That part is not clear to me. I also want to pick on these rolls a little bit here on the morale failure chart, because this is fascinating to me. Fallback fighting versus flee and panic. I understand those two things. That makes sense to me. In between those two options is disengage retreat. How is that different? It's a little too fine grained for me, because I really can't tell you I can tell you how. I don't know. Explain to me, Dan. What does disengage retreat mean, and how is that different from fallback fighting or flee and panic?
So you got to interpret it, right? So obviously the DM has to interpret that. Knowing, if I compare to places like the rules for the fear spell or things like that, my first stab would be that disengage retreat, they're still carrying their weapons. And flee and panic, they throw down their weapons to get away faster. Would be my initial stab at that.
Okay. But they're not continuing. So fallback fighting maybe is they're moving backwards, but still fighting, but just trying to move the fight back into a more defensible position. Whereas disengage retreat is like, I'm going to hang on to my weapons, but I'm done fighting. I'm out of here as quickly as I can go. Okay.
And I bet you could say with disengage, the unit's still a group, and flee and panic is they're just all individuals. That could be part of it.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it feels a little vague to me, and I definitely scratched my head over that chart when I saw it.
I heard that. Yeah. I'm not. Okay. I'm not super happy with the fiddly. I agree with you, Paul. I myself am not super happy with a huge number of gradations of failure. I really don't want that myself.
Yeah. Okay. Let's because we glitched up and lost a few minutes. I'm trying to push us forward a little bit faster. I do too. I'm eager, Dan, to get to the point where we talk about which rules we personally like and what we actually use day to day. But let's. I feel like it is valuable to go through the history here.
Let's at least. So the next one's BX, right? So we should at least look at that, because I feel that's the one that's most
brought
explicit.
Up a few times. Yeah,
frequently this is the first thing, right? People think about this first because with the basic expert set, they had a statistic for morale in the monster stat block. And it's the only time in these rules where that was the case. So it was very visible, and it's very much on people's minds. And for a lot of people, this is the first thing they think of.
Yeah, for sure. This is the one I'm used to. BX is my intro to the game. I'm used to this existing. And at least it's fairly organized in its presentation, right? Telling you their morale scores, here are the numbers, here's when to check it, right? So specifically, looking at the text here, there you go. So it's after a side's first death and when half the monsters have been incapacitated. And I feel like this is pretty easy things to remember, right? First
I
death,
agree.
half. Great. Okay. Got those in my head.
I agree. And the note at the bottom says monsters that successfully check morale twice like that, well, they're going to fight to the death. Yeah. And now, obviously, that's a 2d6 scale, right? So every single monster stat block had this added morale number, and the higher is better. So this is a roll low system, right? Chainmail system B was a roll high on 2d6. Swords and Spells and first edition were roll low percentile is good. And here you've got a roll low on 2d6 system, because the scores are usually 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or something like that. So very simple, very memorable.
Yeah. Okay. Now here's where it starts to get a little vague and head scratchy for me. So everything that's here is clearly kind of team based, right? We're not talking about individual morale. We're talking about like a whole group, right? It says a side in the combat. So how do you deal with this when you have a mixed group of enemies? Let's say you're fighting 6 orcs and an ogre. If they have different morale scores, whose morale score do you use? Right? Is that 2 separate sides? Is the ogres and the, or maybe I make it even more confusing and say, like, there's 2 ogres and 5 orcs, right? Like, are the ogres a separate side? Do they have a first death versus the orcs' first death?
Most of the time, that's the thing the DM has to decide. What would your instinct be?
Well, again, for me, it gets very contextual, and I start to question, like, well, what is the, how cohesive of a group are they, right? Is one person here like the leader, right? Do we have a hobgoblin commander and a bunch of goblins that he's ordering around? In which case, I kind of want to like use the hobgoblins numbers. I don't want to break it down into multiple checks. I think that's going to get to the point of too confusing for me. I don't know. What do you think?
Reasonable. I might. Now, I will say I might be a little bit biased because, on my Thursday night shows, both me streaming the Pool of Radiance video game and the Book of War game on alternate Thursdays, morale is a huge part of both of those games, obviously. And I'm a little bit biased because, of course, Pool of Radiance does separate checks for different types of monsters. So you will absolutely have the kobolds in a fight running away while the trolls stay in the fight. So I don't mind that. It sort of echoes what you're supposed to do with turning undead, if you're someone that uses those rules. So I think either is fine. I might actually make separate rolls for separate types of monsters, but I don't mind what you're saying.
I'm looking at the stats here just to find out, because I made that example up, and I'm like, okay, so ogres have a morale of 10 and orcs have a morale of 8, and this is a roll under, right? Which means that the ogres are more likely to stick around, which is actually, frankly, was opposite of what my gut was going to be there, which is fascinating.
Yes,
because I think of ogres as dumber, and I think orcs are a little more organized, but I don't know. But maybe ogres are dumber, so they're more likely to stick around and not realize that they should have left. Well, I don't know. I guess I could explain this either direction.
Yep. I will say, to me, there's a number, and again, this is one of these pain points that when people say, I play classic D&D, and this comes up on our shows a lot, actually, Paul, someone says, well, what about morale? And I usually, if it's live in the show, I have to say, well, that's a long conversation, which you are experiencing right now, viewers. And there's a lot of things that are happening in the basic rules, like the statistics that you were just looking up, that's very, very different from the original D&D AD&D line. And for example, the top one is that things like dragons and giants in BX don't have great morale scores. So dragons and giants will have scores of like 8 or 9 or 10, which, are good but not great. And that's very distinct from like Chainmail specifically says that giants and dragons are immune morale. They have a morale score of just blank. You're not going to check morale for giants, dragons, or at all. And if you do the math in Swords and Spells or First Edition, once you get to 10 hit dice, your base morale is 100%. So in the AD&D line, big things like giants or dragons are just not going to run away. Whereas in BX, you might get one single casualty and roll like a 9 on 2d6, and your giants are all going to run away. So there's a big difference in intuition that people have depending on what system they use.
All right, if it's all right, Dan, I'm gonna bleed this into how I actually use the rules. We're gonna step away from the history for a moment here. For me, I certainly when I first got into D&D, or not into D&D, but first into going back and playing Classic D after having been a more modern player. I jumped into Labyrinth Lord. I did some BX. I went full hardcore into BX, and I was like, I want to run it exactly by the rules, and I was trying to be very like really immerse myself in it and get to come to grips with the system, which I think was valuable, trying to figure out what I do and don't like and how I would want to customize the game for my own needs. And I tried to run those morale rules, and the fact is that even though I think that they're fairly well outlined, that I would often forget. First of all, I would just be like, oh, that's right, the first monster died and I forgot to roll morale, and I should have done that. Right? Or I would get into these gray areas where I'd say, like, oh, which monster do I use? It's starting to feel very subjective. Never mind the fact that, like, what does fail morale mean? Right? Like, there was so much interpretation that I started to quickly fall back into what I was telling you originally. And I'll go back to my original anecdote, which I apologize, viewers, if we were streaming when I gave this anecdote earlier. I'm not really totally sure when the stream cut out. But this morning, I was speaking to my partner, Tanya, about this, who is not as steeped in gaming as us. She asked, what are you talking about on the show today? And I said, morale. And she said, what's that? I went, wow, that's a big question. Okay. And I found that I had to go back to the wargame roots to explain it, to understand. I said, well, in wargames, you have these big groups of units that's trying to emulate something that happens in actual combat that has been recorded historically, that when two forces meet and collide and start fighting, something happens where one group loses its nerve or whatever, and then they just break and they run, right? So how do you emulate that in a war game? And the question is, okay, we understand that, we made rules for that in Chainmail, that makes sense. How then do you adapt that when you're moving into an adventure game where the groups are much smaller? And especially when one of the groups is controlled on a 1-per-1 basis, where you have individual players. Because obviously we don't roll morale for players, right? Players have complete agency over their characters. None of these systems have ever said that you should roll this for players.
Agreed.
What blurs for me is, as DM, I think it's my job when I'm playing a combat to embody the enemies and role play what I think their state of mind is. And when I'm role playing a group of 5 orcs and 2 ogres, and we're getting into combat and we're fighting, I'm much more inclined to just lean on my own agency and say, do I feel like they should flee? I know their motivations. I know what's going on I know the context of the dungeon they're in. I know what they think they're defending, right? So why don't I just roleplay them and decide for myself when I think they should flee? Why have a system at all? And that's where I ended up. And frankly, I don't use morale at all anymore.
Interesting. And to recap, because these are the key questions that were in the first 5 minutes before we thought to turn on the stream so other people would see it. My take is, again, I kind of don't trust myself to be objective at those moments. And in particular, I feel like the biggest mistake that I made as a young person is that when the monsters started getting the upper hand, because secretly I'm soft on the player characters, I kind of like them, I would find some excuse to make the monsters run away in order to save the player characters. And so and this is a lot of things that I like this, having a simple, formal system to give me objectivity and give me confidence that I'm not pulling an unreasonable Deus Ex Machina to save the characters. So I like having a simple system to roll to tell me whether the monsters stick in the fight. And sometimes I'll be surprised, right? And sometimes I'm surprised. I'm like, oh, I thought they'd be more aggressive, and it turns out they're not. Interesting.
That is fascinating to me, Dan. Not that you want a system to kind of push you out of your own comfort zone. I 100% get that, and that makes total sense to me. But that it's in the direction you're talking about, because in my experience is when someone says I don't use morale rules, I feel like more it means simply the monsters never flee, right? And it's very easy to end up there if you just ignore these rules and whatever, they don't exist, and you just kind of go by the book. I feel it's very easy to come to the conclusion of like every fight is a fight to the death. And I've also seen players play that way often. And that's a separate topic that we've talked about before on the stream somewhere, I'm sure, about how players, get into that mode of thinking. So I would say it is important to internalize that fleeing should always be an option, right? I think it's very important that the rules support fleeing, right? This is a reason why I don't like the kind of attacks of opportunity for disengaging or whatnot. I want fleeing to always be an option and to be possibly even a wise option. And I definitely want my monsters to flee. But I think that my own inclination that I might be fighting is to not make them flee and to fight to the death. And so I think more often I'm on that side of the fence, and then I'm having to convince myself, no, it's okay, it makes sense. They should flee. They're overwhelmed. They should get the hell out of here.
I hear that. I feel. I mean, just to add to what I'm saying, I feel my sense, and I'm not. I've taken a couple self-defense courses briefly. Some of our viewers are much more experienced with that. My sense of those things is that a unit breaking and running is fundamentally an irrational decision. And if you read something like Red Badge of Courage or something like that, the moment when a unit runs is they actually aren't thinking clearly. It becomes an animalistic, irrational moment. And I kind of like that being reflected in a random die roll. So certainly, I wouldn't want to make the mistake of having everything fight to the death. That would be, I think that would be an oversight on my part as a DM. And I agree that I've seen other people, here, I don't use morale and assume that nothing runs away. And I've, like I said, I think before the show, I've seen, a member of a joint publishing group actually rage quit in the 3rd edition era when they discovered that 3rd edition didn't have any morale rules for the first time. And I was trying to say, well, you don't have to have everything fight to the death. You can make a decision, just exactly like you're saying, Paul, or make your own die roll or something like that.
I could see the want for a die roll because you're right. It is not a rational decision, right? It's a purely emotional choice. But I feel like, or at least feels like it should be. I don't know. I've never been in real combat. What do I know? But
understanding. Me too.
Here's the thing, right? When you're the interesting thing for me is in the context of a D&D combat, you're really zoomed in, right? You're really zoomed into one-on-one fighting, right? Like so much of morale makes so much more sense when you're talking about big groups, right? Even in Chainmail, right? The expectation is a single figure is many creatures, many entities, right? So you're always kind of thinking about groupthink. Whereas with D&D, right, and this maybe bleeds into a little bit of what I was asking before, of like when do you make a morale check? Like, do you do it as they're taking the damage on the player's turn, or do you do it, on the monster's turn? Let's assume you're doing it on the monster's turn. I'm going one by one through the monsters and making them do stuff. And so I almost want, and this is going to be way too complicated to actually implement, but I almost want 2 rolls. One to say, does this specific monster lose his nerve or her nerve or their nerve at this point? And then, does that creature losing its nerve and fleeing, explode out and affect the rest of the group? Or do they go, that bastard's a coward, keep fighting, everyone? And I don't want to.
If it was on a computer, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're right. If it was on a computer, we would totally implement that, right? That's absolutely what we do. Yeah. And I think everybody agrees, me included, that would be too complicated to actually implement at the table. So I don't mind, right? I don't mind the abstraction of just a binary, does this unit flee or not? Seems
what do you do, Dan?
An okay approximation.
Let's say you have a group of 6 players and they're fighting, I don't know, 20 goblins because they're slightly more powerful. Great. And the combat kind of bifurcates into like, oh, this group over here is fighting these 8 goblins, and this group over here is fighting these 12 goblins, and it kind of spreads out. Do you start to think of them as separate groups? Do you roll morale separately for those? or is it still just all the goblins?
I feel like this is great, but I feel like I'm in a philosophy class with Paul, and I'm being given a variant of the trolley problem. I've never done that.
No,
that hasn't occurred to me to date. That's an interesting question. If I was a player and a DM did that, I wouldn't mind. I'd be like, yeah, okay, I get that. I've never done that.
I think more likely you're going to see it in a case of, like, let's say you have a group of goblins and an evil human fighter who's leading them, right? Who's clearly the leader and is whipping them into shape, right? And then you end up with like, oh, well, our heroic fighter decides to go one-on-one combat with the leader, and that's happening over here. And then over there, the goblins are fighting the rest of the people. Like, now you definitely have these two distinct groups, and like, I don't know, watching your leader fall to the big bad fighter, that's gonna really like hurt versus like, oh, one goblin fell, why would the fighter leave? That's crazy, right?
I will say that, like, I agree, and like BX has 2 triggers for morale, right? Swords and Spells has 14. First edition, right? First
Somewhere
edition has
between there
5.
is the right number.
Yeah. So first edition has 5, right? And they among the 5 triggers are when a quarter of the party is down, when half of the party is down, and the other 2 are having the leader go down, right? So the leader unconscious is one of the triggers, and the leader slain is one of the 5 triggers. So frankly, what you just said is an approximation in my head. That's more or less what I expect to happen for simple morale rules, is particular percentages, and the leader goes down. That's a morale check too. That's actually sort of my basket of triggers.
But what about the inverse, Dan? If you're going by BX rules, when one goblin falls, the leader should make a morale check, right?
Yeah, I guess that's what it says. Yeah.
And I'm not sure. That feels weird to me. That's
fair.
But I don't know. That's where I land. For me personally, and again, this is totally a personal choice, but for me personally, there's enough gray areas here that I just start to reject systemization. I just go, nope. The rules are always going to fail me, and I'm going to end up in this subjective case where I just have to make a choice. So I might as well just make a choice. That's where I land.
So interestingly, if it just to touch back on the history again, right? The overall trend was to have to step away from morale rules. So it's clearly a core part of. You get it 3 times in Chainmail. If that doesn't convince you enough, it's clearly stated in original D&D. It's clearly stated in first edition AD&D. It's not labeled as optional there. In BX, when we didn't mention before, it's clearly labeled as optional, right? It has a big optional tag at the top of that text for BX that we were looking at before. In second edition, and honestly, second edition AD&D does this all the time, and it's one of my least favorite things about second edition AD&D is that many of the rules, and I don't have it on a screenshot because it takes many pages in second edition. Many of the rules in second edition is, well, DM, you could do it this way, or you could do it this way. We don't really actually have a particular rule for it. You want to do it this way? Okay. You want to do it this way? Okay. And so the 2, I think, opinions that Paul and I have today, they're both in second edition. The second edition DM's guide says, okay, version A, you could just role play it. You could just make decisions based on fiat, like Paul's talking about. And then version 2 is, or there's a dice mechanic that you might possibly consider. So, and here's a bunch of tables and a bunch of, base morale and a bunch of modifiers. And when you roll it, you might consider using dice if you want. So, and for what it's worth, that's a 2d10 system. So if someone started with second edition, their instinct might be to do a 2d10 system because second edition likes d10s a lot. And I think it's roll low, I believe. And so second edition has both. If you trying to make everybody happy, probably nobody was. and then as of third edition, it was gone. Right, as of third edition, it was gone. There's no morale rules. It never came back. That was as of 2000 was specifically the cutoff point where morale doesn't exist in D&D anymore.
It's unfortunate, Dan, because I think like you and I, like the reason we're having this conversation, right, is that it came up, I think, a lot in Elder Times, right? You're playing Pool of Radiance, they implemented morale, and it is actually, in fact, a key mechanic and one that I strategize around when playing that game, right? I often think about, for example, here's a tactic I use. I don't know if you've ever used this in Pool of Radiance, where I cast sleep on a bunch of the monsters right in front of you. There's a huge pile of monsters. I cast Leap on the pile right in front of me, and I absolutely prioritize killing them quickly. I prioritize killing them quickly because I'm trying to trigger morale checks. Trying to like get them to the point where like, yep, enough have died that they're gonna run or flee or surrender. Which is, I don't know if we've talked about surrendering yet. That's an interesting angle. So yeah, it's a mechanic that you play against and becomes a tactic, and I enjoy that. I like it. I like that being in the game. Absolutely. But it's complex. I mean, just the way we're talking about it here, it's clear that like trying to write one unified system for all of this is hard.
I have my interpretation that is simple enough. I just have it in my head. I don't look anything up.
So what's your system? When do you check, Dan? When do you check?
Oh,
that's my.
And let me just point out, I got to apologize to the viewers. So multiple viewers are saying that there's an optional version for Morale in 5th edition. I failed to find it. So if someone could throw in the chat the page number for me to find it later, I apologize. My search skills failed because I couldn't even find the word morale in the 5th edition book. So what I do in D&D, if viewers watch our Book of Stream games Thursday nights, and we have another one coming up this Thursday, as a matter of fact, I do the same thing in D&D. So my Book of War rule is based on the reaction table in original D&D. I don't know if you want to pull that up again, Paul, because we haven't seen that in this version of the show with the red dot there. So there's the 2d6 reaction table in original D&D Volume 1. And the text that comes a little bit later that I highlighted there says non-player characters and men-at-arms will have to make morale checks using either the above reaction table or chainmail. So technically that's 4 different systems that I guess the DM has to pick from. And I basically do this. So it's a 2d6 roll, and I say that my interpretation is if you roll 9 or higher, that's good, right? 9 or higher is good. And to reflect the impression that Swords and Spells or 1st edition gets a bonus from hit dice, I roll 2d6 and I add the hit dice to the monster. If you get 9 or more, they stick in the fight. If it's less than that, they run away. And that's what I do in the Book of War play, and that's also what I do in D&D. And it works well enough. My triggers are, like it says in Chainmail man-to-man, I check at every 3rd casualties. So 1/3, 2/3, which is 2 rolls at most. And that seems to work okay for me.
Okay.
Now, the issue is that, like, again, people's instinct, if they play BX, they're going to dispute that adding the hit dice because, again, they're going to be accustomed to things like even hill giants running away pretty quickly. But under this system, once you get to 8 hit dice, you can't fail morale anymore. And sometimes people will dispute that. But it's in line with Swords and Spells or Chainmail or 1st edition. And personally, I'm comfortable with that. Other DMs will differ.
Of course, and in course in BX, we have a whole separate stat, which I assume kind of follows the hit die maybe a little bit, right? Like,
I would argue kind of not. Only so bit. Like you pointed out the issue of, I think orcs have higher morale than ogres or something like that. So
no, the other way around. Ogres have higher morale.
Okay, but just a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's 10 versus 8.
Yeah. So I argue kind of not. And again, if people have the BX sensibility, they're usually surprised that Giants and Dragons won't have never check morale in Chainmail or 1st edition effectively. So that's a point where different DMs are going to have very different opinions.
Interesting. So. I don't know. Apologies to anyone who came to the stream for answers. And, we clearly disagree on this.
Well, and let me say this, right? So this is one of these things that comes up, and for example, like my arena simulator, like I want to see what's the danger level of different monsters versus standard characters, and I have this code on GitHub that will run millions of D&D combat stipulations in order to gauge how dangerous a monster is, so I can give experience, right, and stuff like that. And frequently people come when I'm talking about that and say, does it do morale? And I have to say no, because there's no morale system that anybody's going to agree on. Again, there's at least 8 different systems I can point to in 3 in Chainmail, 1 in original D&D with us a reaction table, first edition Swords and Spells, second edition battle system, and then here comes Pool of Radiance. And thanks to our viewer Seeker, who pointed out Pool of Radiance has a completely different morale system that isn't actually based on the first edition rules. They made up a completely new one. So the fact that you're not going to get a majority of classic DMs agreeing on what the morale system is means that I feel that I can't, take that for granted in my simulator or my adventures. And when we were talking to Matt Finch a couple weeks ago, he was grappling with the same thing. Again, he had to kind of make up a new morale system, again, that's kind of in between these ones that we're talking about to try to make, classic players happy, because there is no one system.
Well, Dan, we were about out of time here, so I'm going to have to call for final thoughts on morale.
I mean, I have my interpretation that I'm very happy with and works for us. And you can see me, implementing it in Book of War Thursday nights in our head. There's no table lookup. Dan, my gaming partner, Gamma Dan Cullinan, never played before a couple months ago, and he just does it in his head all the time now. My partner Isabel is not a big, hardcore war gamer, and again, she could just do it in her head all the time. So I would recommend, if you're looking for a system, go to oedgames.com, pick up my judges rules, and I've got it laid out in 2 lines there with a really big endnote describing all the places that I was picking little pieces from in original D&D and why specifically. That works pretty well for me. And again, I like having a formal mechanic to give me guidance and, sometimes surprise me and not go too soft on the players, and those and to remind me that this is a moment where it's going to be frightening and irrational, frankly. And I like the formal dice-based mechanic, and I like it simple. It works for me.
I mean, I agree that it works in a war game. I think that it does not scale to an RPG. I think that there's so many gray areas for me that I don't like it. It just leads to more questions, and inevitably I'm going to have to be making a judgment call one way or the other, so I might as well just always do that. I do encourage people, though, to consider if and when monsters should flee. I don't know that it always needs to be a cut and dry question. Like any question I have in gaming when I'm behind the DM screen, if I'm a little unsure, like, I don't know, they could flee or they might not flee, I'll just roll a die for it behind the screen, just quickly, off the cuff, with no systemization of just to say, well, it's 50-50, or it's, 2 and 6, go, roll the die. But I like being able to very quickly in my head take into account all of the variables of the context, right? Are these monsters under the thrall of a boss somewhere else, or are they, defending their home? What is the situation? I think ultimately for me it's always situational, and I'd rather just role play the monsters and decide for me when it makes sense for them to flee. But I do think fleeing should always be an option and should be part of the game. I think it's important.
Agreed. So, and for me, I like having a base rule for the mechanic, and then for those judgmental factors, which have to be part of it. I totally agree with that. I add 1 or 2 points to my 2d6. And I roll it in public, right? I tell the players, if these 2 dice come up they're going to run away, and the players are really, really invested in how that die roll comes up in public. So that one, I guess we're going to have to agree to disagree a little bit on with Paul.
Yep, pretty much. Players, if you have an opinion, please leave us a comment here in the YouTube video. Tell us what system you prefer, whether you want to role play it, whether you want to dice for it, is there an addition that works best for you, or have you come up with your own variation that works even better? Obviously, it's a contentious issue for us, so we'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe at some point we'll do a poll or something. That would be interesting to find out how people are running stuff. But leave us your thoughts, and maybe that will spur on further conversations about this in the future.
Or just roll 2d6 and look up the reaction table and leave a comment about what reaction is. Maybe it was hostile. Maybe it was acceptance. And of course, remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us. We're on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and TikTok. And we have the handle Wandering DMs on all those sites. So look for us there, and you'll get updates on upcoming shows.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can do so. Those podcasts are available on our website at wanderingdms.com. or you can find us on other podcast carriers such as iTunes and Spotify and Google Podcasts. If you're listening to us on one of those sites right now, please take a moment, if possible, to rate and review us on that site. It helps other users of that site find us, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And of course, big thanks to our patrons who support the show every month. And if you'd like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms. You'll see our different tiers you can select from. And even the $1 tier gets you access to our Discord server where the conversation is continually ongoing. And just like Paul said at the top of the show, we have an after chat video on Discord out every Sunday about 10 minutes after we get done here. So I'll be there today. I think Paul has to take off today. I have a lot more to say about this, frankly. It's a big subject. There's many different systems, even in classic D&D. So I personally was really looking forward to the after chat today to see what other people's systems are. I know that some of our viewers that are regular participants there disagree with me about some of these things. So I kind of want to hear them defend their positions. And if you're new to our after chat, please jump in and tell us yourself.
Unfortunately, I have to flee this afternoon, but I hope that some of our patrons will take up my flag of just roleplay the monsters and fight the good fight for me in the after chat.
That's good. Well, so you're tapping out and you're looking for some other leader to take on. I understand. You know what? That happens. Yeah. That's realistic, right? That's what we call verisimilitude right there. So if you want to see me implementing the morale rules that I use for my Book of War game that's based on classic D&D, which is the same thing that I do in D&D, please tune in this Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Gamma Dan will be back there. We're also, another thing for our patrons on Discord this week, we're asking our patrons to come up with the armies. Maybe there's some kind of army you've wanted to see us play test that we haven't done so yet. Jump on Discord, suggest the army, and we'll randomly pick one for each of us, and that's what we'll be playtesting this Thursday. And of course, the games always hinge on morale. That's what the games come down to all the time, is really the morale checks ultimately. Very dramatic. I'm glad that they're there, and I'm glad that they're, for me, they make sense as part of D&D. I guess I'm getting a last shot in here, am I not? Sorry, Paul.
Dan, no, I don't think you are, because you're talking about a war game which has nothing to do with D&D. Go on, Dan. Wrap us up, please. I do have to get out of here.
Remember, viewers, we are alive. We're so glad that you were here with us today. We are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, so please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.